Hello and welcome to the first of what will be a series of shorter videos covering some tips and tricks on using the DazToHue workflow and also some basic Houdini tips for those that are new to the software. In this video I'll be focusing on the Occlusion node and looking at some of the new features available in release 0.3, in particular how we can use these manual occlusion attributes to define parts of the geometry that we want to either retain regardless of any auto occlusion options, or parts of the geometry that we want to manually delete. So to get started, I will enable occlusion culling and I'll add an occlusion operation here, an auto occlusion operation, and we will be using the character's clothing to occlude the body. And you can see by default it's obviously occluding too much of the geometry, so it's deleting parts of the geometry that aren't occluded by the clothes. Now we could fiddle with the options we have to try and correct that, to bring that back. But rather than doing that, I will show you how we can use this retain attribute option to basically tell the occlusion node that there's some parts of the body that we never want to delete. So to get started, I will make a bit of space between the occlusion node and the skin node. And what I'm going to do is drop down an attribute paint node, because we'll be painting onto parts of the geometry that we want to retain. So if I right click in the network editor here and start typing in paint, we want to select this attribute paint node and just place that down. Then I'm going to take the first output of the skin node, and this is our FBX skin data stream, and I'll plug that into the attribute paint node. Then I'll plug the output of the paint node into the first input of the occlusion node. So by default, nothing has changed. Now with the attribute paint node selected, actually first thing I'll do is rename it to retain, just so we know what it's doing. Then under the attributes tab, I'm going to rename this attribute. By default it's mask, but in this case I'll just call it retain. It doesn't matter what it's called, but it's useful to give it a meaningful name. We want to change the attribute type from float to integer. So really only interested in point values of 0 or 1. We're not really interested in any values between 0 or 1 because a point can't be partially deleted. It's either fully deleted or it's not deleted at all. Under the symmetry tab, I will enable symmetry just so I can paint both sides of the model at once. And then under the brush tab, I just like to change the shape from volume to surface. I just find it paints a little better. So with our attribute paint node still selected, if I hover over the viewport and press the enter key, we will enter paint mode. And I can use the scroll wheel on my mouse to change the brush size. And if I start painting onto the character, you'll see that parts of the character where we're painted are turning red. Those parts are where the attribute value will be 1, and parts that aren't red will have an attribute value of 0. So the red parts are what will be retained by the occlusion node. But you've probably also noticed we have a problem, which is that we are painting on the character's clothing as well as the body. And in this case, we only want to paint on the character's body. If we have a look at the attribute paint node, it does have a group selection, but unfortunately it's empty in our case. That's because it's looking for point groups, and our geometry doesn't have any point groups. All the groups on our geometry that come in from Daz Studio have primitive groups. And we can check that by having a look at this geometry spreadsheet. And here we are on the points selection. You can see all of the data attributes that are stored on all of the points of our geometry, but there's no groups. If we change over to the primitives tab, you'll see all of these groups that are on the character's primitives. Now, as it's Houdini, there are multiple ways we could deal with this. We could, for example, create some point groups or the way I'm going to do it is actually split the body off from the clothing and just pass the body into the attribute paint node and then merge them back together. So that's what I'll show you how to do now. So again, over in the network editor, we'll right click, and this time we'll type in split. We want to select this top split node. Now another quick tip is that if you hover over a wire, it will insert the node with those wires already connected. And now with the split node selected, I'm just going to change angles just to try and avoid YouTube getting angry at me for any accidental nudity. But on the split node, under the group option, I will now select the character's body. And you can see that the clothing has disappeared, and it's only showing the character's body, and that is what's being passed to the attribute paint node. Now after our paint operation, we then want to merge the clothing and the body back together again. And the way the split node works is that anything that is selected up here in the group option will be passed out of the first output, and anything that isn't selected will be passed out of the second output. So in order to merge those back again, it will right click again, and this time I'll type in merge. We'll select this top merge option, and again I'll hover over now this wire here, and that will connect that up. And then I will take the second output of the split node, which in this case is our character's clothing, and I'll also connect it to the merge node. And now you can see at this point our character and the clothing have been merged back together again. Now another quick tip, which you may not be familiar with, is that Houdini has this concept of display flags, which is this blue box here. So you can set the display flag to any node in the network editor, and it will show the output of that node. However, you don't have to be working on the node that's currently set with the display flag. So for example, I could display the output of this merge node, but if I select the attribute paint node, I can still work with that node. So I'll reset the changes we made previously. So now if I start painting, you'll see that we are only painting on the character's body and not the character's clothing. So with that all in place, hopefully that's easy enough to follow. So just to recap, we are splitting the geometry into two streams. We have the character's body coming out of the first output and the clothing out of the second output. We are then just painting on the character's body an attribute that we've called retain in this case. We are then merging both streams back together again and passing it all into the occlusion node. So now if I select the occlusion node, you'll see we have this retain attribute option, and if I select the drop down, you'll now see we have a retain attribute that we can select there. So now to actually see this working, we can set the display flag on the occlusion node itself, and then just select our attribute paint node and start painting, and we should see that the areas we paint are being brought back and no longer deleted. Now, depending on the mesh density of your character, there is a little bit of a lag as you paint because it is in real time running through the occlusion operations. To speed up painting a bit, we can set the display flag back to the merge node. Now we won't see the occlusion updating in real time, but it is a lot faster to paint. And then we can just set the display flag back to the occlusion node to see how we're tracking, where we're up to. So I'll paint right around this waistline here. And then just check it by going back to the occlusion node. You can see our waist has been brought back. I'll just fix up these parts here as well. I'll just set it back there just to speed things up. So what we're basically doing again is just saying any of these red parts will never get deleted regardless of any auto occlusion operations. Quickly go around there. Okay, so if we go back to the occlusion node, if we select the occlusion node, in fact, we will get rid of the paint overlay. Now we can just see the end result. And remember, we have this transparency slider here that we can adjust as well. So that's one way of telling the occlusion node not to delete parts of the geometry. Another thing to just mention is that you don't have to use any auto occlusion operations at all. You can manually paint parts of the character that you want to delete. And the process is basically the same. So to demonstrate that, what I'm going to do is copy our retain attribute paint node and paste it. And I'll put it after the first one. And this time I'll change it to delete, just so we know what it is. And then under its attributes tab, I will rename the attribute from retain to delete. I'll leave it as integer, and I'll leave symmetry and the brush options the same. So now the points on our character have two attributes. One is retain and one is delete. Now, what I'll do is temporarily disable the retain attribute. And under our occlusion node, under the delete attribute, we will now have a delete option that we can select. And now if I click on the delete attribute paint node and start painting, we should see that wherever I'm painting, parts of the character will be deleted. And it is. So this is a way of just bypassing all of the auto occlusion operations and just manually painting the parts of the character that you want to delete. Now you may have noticed that we don't have any transparency anymore. Auto occlusion groups will have their transparency set automatically. If there are no auto occlusions though, we have this transparency group option that we can use. So in this case I can select under the name of the character's clothing, and it will have a transparency applied again. Now if I go back to the delete paint node, we can see under the clothing the parts of the character that we are deleting. It's just a way of getting more precise results, I suppose. The final thing to mention is that we can use both the retain and delete attributes in tandem. But the important part to know is that the retain attribute will always win out. So if any point on our character has both the retain and delete attributes set to 1, that point will be retained. So basically retain trumps everything. So to just quickly demonstrate that, what I'll do is delete part of this chest area. And then if I turn our retain attribute back on, you will see that chest has been brought back, and that's because we painted the retain attribute there. We did miss these little points here, so we'll just grab those. And likewise, if I paint the retain attribute on two parts of the mesh that have the delete attribute applied, those parts will come back. So that's just something to be mindful of as you're working with this. So that's it for this crash course on the DazToHue occlusion node. I hope you found it useful. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.